Hello and welcome to this Net English walkthrough, today focusing on the poem Tissue from the AQA Power and Conflict Poetry Anthology. Now, as ever, we're going to start with a quick reading of the poem. So, Tissue. Paper that lets the light shine through, this is what could alter things. Paper thinned by age or touching. The kind you find in well-used books, the back of the Quran, where a hand has written in the names and the histories, who was born to whom, the height and weight, who died where and how, on which sepia date. Pages smoothed and stroked and turned transparent with attention. If buildings were paper, I might feel their drift, see how easily they fall away on a sigh, a shift in the direction of the wind. Maps too. The sun shines through their borderlines, the marks the rivers make, roads, rail tracks, mountain folds. Fine slips from grocery shops that say how much was sold and what was paid by credit card might fly our lives like paper kites. An architect could use all of this, place layer over layer, luminous script over numbers over line, and never wish to build again with brick or block, but let the daylight break through capitals and monoliths, through the shapes that pride can make. Find a way to trace a grand design with living tissue, raise a structure never meant to last, of paper, smoothed and stroked and thinned to be transparent, turned into your skin. Now let's start by talking about Imtiaz Dharka, the poet. So Imtiaz Dharka was born in 1954. She was born in Pakistan, but she grew up in Glasgow, and she's described herself as a Scottish Muslim Calvinist who spent a lot of time in England, Wales and India. Now Dharka is best known as a poet, and actually was considered for the role of Poet Laureate at one point. But she's also a filmmaker and a pen and ink artist, and she often illustrates her own poetry collections. Now, unsurprisingly, Dharka is deeply interested in quite politicised issues, such as comparative cultures, identities, social and geographical displacement, personal freedom, conflict, and also the rights of women and children. The poem Tissue is taken from Dharka's collection The Terrorist at My Table, and it's a collection of poems exploring identity and knowledge. The poem is built around the multiple meanings of tissue, referring both to thin paper, tissue paper, and also to specialized organic cells, living tissue. And that ambiguity allows Dharka to explore the tension between permanence and impermanence, between the organic and the inorganic, between the public and the private, and also between different ideas and views regarding value. The poem is written in quatrains of lines of varying lengths, and it doesn't have a rhyme scheme, although there is a final single line stanza that rounds off the poem as a whole and seems to distill the meaning of the poem. In a sense, this allows an interplay between the order, the quatrains, and the disorder, the irregular line lengths, and that reflects the wider tension in the poem between tissue and tissue, paper and the body, the artificial and the natural. The first quatrain of the poem focuses on paper that lets the light shine through, so tissue paper, with the idea of light shining through suggesting that this is paper through which we can find both literal and metaphorical illumination. It allows us to see, and that allows access to understanding. Light has connotations not simply of clarity and sight, but of positivity, of hope, of belief. As the poem notes, this kind of paper is what could alter things, what could offer a way forwards, the kind of paper that is thinned by age or touching, and that allows us then to learn from the values of the past and also the experiences of those who have lived them, who've touched this paper. Notice that from the very beginning of the poem, it's the tactile engagement, the physical contact, the touch that matters most. The paper that's important shows its value by how thin it's become over time, through the quantity and the quality of human interaction that it's had. The second stanza begins with an example of the sort of paper referenced here, that found in well-used books, such as in the back of the Quran, where a hand has written in the names and histories. Now again, the use to which or through which the text has been put shows its value, its importance. Clearly it's been read and reread and re-reread. And for a devout Muslim, there's no more important text than the Quran itself, since it's believed to be the unadulterated and perfect word of God. Now, for many Muslims, in fact, recording the names and histories, adding writing to pages at the back of the Quran, even if blank, would be seen as sacrilegious. However, the recording of the family information also positions the text as central within the life of the family, not just a religious text and thus a record of belief, but a family record, perhaps offering also an alternative perspective that it's the unifying function of the text, the way it acts as a locus for the family and offers a sense of continuity for the successive generations that matters most. It's interesting that the writing has been completed by a hand, not a person or individual, and does the individual matter here in the grand scheme of things, but simply an anonymous hand. The writing they produced is the record of their existence, and as a result, what seems to have given them meaning here. Now, the details recorded in the back of this Quran, this central record of who was born to whom, the height and weight, who died where and how, seems to position human life as of central importance. But there's an irony in that the lives have passed, but the record remains. However, it's also ironic in the sense that these details, however clear and comprehensive they may seem, are simply recorded figures. They're not a real record of the people behind them. There's a sense in which recording these details is seen as making the people they concern real, but it also, ironically, serves to show how ephemeral, how fleeting these lives are. The pages have been smoothed and stroked and turned transparent, and the triplet of verbs, the repeated conjunction and the enjambment, all offer a sense of continuous and personal, physical, almost intimate interaction over a period of time. The details are a record of the family, but so is the condition of the paper on which those details are recorded. It's worth noting, I think, that smoothed and stroked both relate to not just interactions with a page, with paper, but also to a relationship with the human body, with skin. In the fourth stanza, Darker shifts to a different image of buildings being paper. Now, the metaphor involves considering a different time frame, one in which buildings can drift, fall away on a sigh, or a shift in the direction of the wind. Everything, this suggests, will eventually fade and fall away on a long enough time frame, and from a broad enough perspective. Paper may seem fragile and temporary, as is the human body, but building with brick and stone is no less so if we think long term. And these are not things that are recorded in the same way as human lives. They're not seen as being meaningful in the same way. That's despite pronouns such as their and they, seeming to almost personify them. The wind is also, notice, compared to a sigh, and that's implicitly juxtaposing, again, the enormity of scale, wind, with the personal and the intimate, the sigh. The implication is also that everything is subject to the wider forces that surround us, to the direction of the wind, both literally, because wind destroys buildings, and metaphorically, wind as is symbolizing the direction of time and culture and history and humanity. Now, maps are a particularly effective metaphor in the poem, introduced in the fifth stanza as another example of the paper that Darker is describing. Maps, obviously, are a way of representing scope and scale and relationships between geographical points. We had connectivity over time with the writing in the Quran, and here we have connectivity over space in terms of the map. These paper items allow us to situate those from the past in both time and space. Darker tells us that the sun shines through their borderlines, and there's a connection back to the light image introduced in the first stanza. The borderlines here are metaphorically illuminating in the sense of revealing information. The distinctions and separations and conflicts that have led to this division, borders, obviously, are a point of both connection and separation. But the sun shining through also suggests that light, as in truth, hope, clarity, knows no borders, and perhaps even that these points of transition can be meaningless and imposed human constructs. Now, the borders listed, notice, are of two kinds. Those that are natural and geographical, as in rivers and mountain folds, and those that are imposed or constructed by people, so roads, rail tracks. Rivers, roads and rail tracks also link to movement, to the onward progression of things, to change and to development, and to the impact of these things on the landscape in the same way that paper shows the marks of creases and folds, and skin shows the wrinkles and creases of time. The image of maps flows into a focus on fine slips that say how much was sold, so receipts. Much like the records of the family written in the back of the Quran, these slips tell us how much was sold and what was paid, so reducing the complexities and intricacies and activities of a human life into tiny details by which we navigate what someone bought and for how much. Now these might fly our lives like paper kites, Darker tells us, and there's an ambiguity to the image. Are the receipts the paper kites, in the sense of these high points that allow us to trace the string back to the person flying them? Or, more probably, are our lives the paper kites, fragile and temporary, buffeted by the direction of the wind? Were the receipts the strings by which we trace and hold on to the end point, the kites, the lives? Either way, the receipts are presented as having significance or value only as a piece of the puzzle, as signifiers of the life that lay behind them, rather than in and of themselves. And those lives could perhaps, the 7th stanza suggests, be traced back, reconstructed from all these paper items, the maps and receipts and well-used books. An architect could place layer over layer, script over numbers over line. So the richness and complexity of the life so constructed would mean that the architect would never wish to build again with brick. The issue in some ways is the reversal required. The life would have to be consciously and deliberately and retrospectively reconstructed through the records in order to understand the original spontaneous and continuous lived experiences that led to them. Now the script, notice, is luminous. Again, it's script that lets the light shine through, perhaps that shines through the page. Script, text, the written word. These are prioritized over numbers, as in dates and amounts, and also over line, that's frameworks and structures, associated with more meaning than simple numerical details, such as names and histories, height and weight, how much, what was paid. The truth of the life and the illumination provided by attempting to understand it would let the daylight break through capitals and monoliths. Capitals here referring potentially to both cities and buildings, and also text, perhaps even proper nouns. Now capitals and monoliths are impressive but apparently static things, linked to the shapes that pride can make, to the constructions of human arrogance, often used to represent or signify the apparent importance of an event or a life, and yet still temporary, subject to the direction of the wind once again, and able to fall away on a sigh. In contrast, this attempt to understand the totality of a life through the collated fragments associated with it would offer greater clarity, greater truth, would allow an attempt to instead trace a grand design with living tissue. Trace can refer both to an artistic endeavour and also a gentle touch, bridging the gap between those two meanings of tissue that I discussed earlier, both paper and the body. And notice that the grand design is traced with living tissue, a living person engaging with and connecting with a lived life. As a side note, the reference to the human body and the human life as a grand design perhaps leaves open a question around whether there's a religious dimension to the metaphor, that a person is something intended and designed, something created and crafted. And the structure was never meant to last. The temporary nature of the human body and the human life, thinned by age or touching, that can fall away on a sigh, is what gives it immediacy and meaning, driven through the single sentence that runs throughout the full stanzas. And the paper, smoothed and stroked and thinned to be transparent, mirrors physical intimacy. There's a sense of continuity created by the connectives and emphasizing the importance of prioritizing the human body, human life and human connection rather than the script and the numbers and the line. Though it's also clearly of value to engage with the lived lives of those who've gone before through those things. The final single line of "the paper turned into your skin" offers a conclusion to the musings and the metaphors that run throughout the poem. Beyond the paper trail of the Quran, the pages, the buildings, the maps, the fine slips, beyond all the records and the details, there are people. There's a person, traced back through and traced back to the smoothing and stroking and thinning. In a sense, what Darker is offering in the poem is an extended metaphor for the value of engaging with the lives of those who've gone before, and of the relative importance of humanity in comparison to objects, and, to be fair, of the inescapable complexity and profundity of a human life. However, it also becomes quite an intimate love poem to an anonymous, perhaps lost, perhaps remembered individual, your skin, and perhaps, ultimately, a love poem to the ephemeral beauty of memory, humanity, and of human connection. In terms then of links and comparisons within the AQA Anthology, Tissue links to obviously checking out the history in terms of the relationship with the past and the contrast, the juxtaposition of the value of people, as it does potentially also with a poem such as, say, The Emigre or Kamikaze. Now, the view of objects, of construction, and of the fragility of people also links possibly to poems such as My Last Duchess, to Ozymandias, or even perhaps to Poppies or to London. And thank you very much, as ever, for listening. Now, don't forget, there's a whole range of videos available on the Net English YouTube channel. That's www.youtube.com/netenglish1. And there's also the podcast versions of some talk-throughs on some of the poems and the other texts available through Academy websites.